Welcome to episode 354 of the DFO Rundown. I'm Frank Seravalli. My usual co-host Jason Greger has his head in the sand in Hawaii, which means I'm joined today by my good buddy Ryan S. Clark of ESPN, national hockey writer. Ryan, how you doing?
Good, Frank. How are you doing?
I'm good. Need to let you know that the DFO Rundown is brought to you by Bet365. Open an account with Bet365 today and bet on a huge range of markets. Use promo code NATION, NATION. Whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. We've got a Super Bowl matchup set. You're going to have all the props, everything you want to get into, in addition to all of the usual hockey bets and everything else going on at Bet365 today. Ryan, massive weekend in the NHL. Some huge news. Mikko Rantanen on the move from Colorado to Carolina. What were you doing on Friday night when it hit you?
Definitely not sitting there going, I wonder if the Colorado Avalanche are going to trade Mikko Rantanen. You know, it's strange. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on just everything, given how bizarre it was. But it's one of those, did you really think it was going to happen? But also, once it happened, you're like, well, there's reasons why it makes sense for the Colorado Avalanche, which we'll get into. But it's this whole idea that you look at what the Avalanche have done to become successful the last several years, and there's a conversation that gets had. It's Nathan MacKinnon, it's Mikko Rantanen, Cale Makar, Gabriel Landeskog, and then it's like, well, it's other people too. But no one ever thought Mikko Rantanen would leave, but it seemed like each passing month you didn't hear news on a deal. It's like that possibility grew and grew. Maybe not to the extent of, let's say, like a Matthew Tkachuk leaving Calgary sort of situation, but like it was always there. But it was like, but he'll sign, but then he didn't. So what about you? I mean, yes, you've had a busy weekend. You were clearly the person who broke all this. So what was it like sort of seeing it from your vantage point, kind of your thoughts on seeing it play out in real time?
Yeah, so I had heard some rumblings, I think I first started making calls about whether or not Mikko Rantanen was truly available back during World Junior. And it's funny because I think there were obviously teams asking. I mean,
Of
the
course.
longer this goes on, you see reports about Rantanen and the Avs not seeing eye to eye on the next deal, that teams are going to call and inquire. But the way that it was positioned to me was, if you hear his name out there, it's really the Avs trying to squeeze and get the Rantanen camp back to the table. And clearly that wasn't accurate. I think the overarching thought that I have is, it's a total aside from the deal, but Ryan, you covered the Avs for a long time and you know a lot of those people there. I can't imagine what it was like for Chris MacFarland to pick up the phone and call Nathan MacKinnon and tell him that he just traded Mikko Rantanen. That's the part that my jaw is still on the floor about.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure everybody saw the post-game interview after their loss to the Bruins, whether it was Nathan MacKinnon or Jared Bednar, and you can tell that there is still this sense of shock of what just happened. You think about all the moments this team has gone through over the last few years, whether it be winning a cup, the first-round exit, everything with Valeri Nichushkin, Gabriel Landeskog, his absences. You are bringing in guys like Zach Parise to win, only to see them not win a cup. And now you have this, and when you look at this, it seems like this was one of those moments that almost carried the greatest weight of all, just because the assumption was he was always going to be a fixture. But the reality of Chris MacFarland's situation and that of every general manager in the league, and Frank, you know this better than anyone, it is about winning, but it is also about winning in a way that allows you to remain financially flexible. And for all the talent the Avalanche has, Nathan MacKinnon's cost money. Cale Makar is up in 3 years, 2 years? That's going to get expensive. And when you look at the range, or the alleged range that Mikko Rantanen was looking to pursue, it's one thing to take on 2 of those guys, even though the cap is raising. But to take on 3, how do you take that on and then still try to find ways to get better? Especially when you're a franchise that, unlike, oddly enough, the Carolinas of the world, while you've been able to bring up guys from within, it hasn't been this steady, consistent stream like we've seen with the Hurricanes, where it seems like every year, every other year, they're bringing up at least 1 or 2 players from that farm system that are easily and immediately making a difference.
I think the thing I just keep coming back to, though, is anytime you draw a hard line in the sand like the Avs have done, it probably feels good now. I mean, not right now, but to say we had to rip the Band-Aid off. We had to do something. This is our line. We're not crossing it, and we're moving on. I just think no matter what, 100 times out of 100, when you make, I'm not going to call it a silly rule, but I think it's an arbitrary rule because you can move the line anywhere you want. In the end, you're the team that loses. And I say that because we know the cap is going up in such a significant way. It's likely increasing somewhere between $7 to $9 million this summer. Mikko Rantanen was already making $9.25. It's not like he was down in the previous McKinnon range in the sixes, and he had to go from 6 to 14. You're talking about from 9, let's just call it 14 because I think that's what it would have gotten it done. That's the Draisaitl deal. 9.25 to 14. You mean to tell me you can't find a way to come up with $4.75 million to keep him? Like, you can, and I understand this whole idea of deeper and cheaper, which is what the Avs are going with. But we're talking about a player who's top 5 in the league in points the last handful of years. We're talking about a horse of a human being. We're talking about a proven one of the best playoff performers of his generation. 100 points in 82 career playoff games. There's only so many of those guys to go around. So you can draw the hard line if you want. But I just think any team, hey, we don't do signing bonus. We don't do no trade clauses. We don't do this, and that. Like, you end up losing. Ask the St. Louis Blues how they feel about not having Alex Pietrangelo. They played the hardest of hardball for a guy that delivered a Stanley Cup to them. They haven't done anything since he left. He goes to Vegas and helps them win a cup because they wouldn't give him signing bonus. They wouldn't give him the full no trade. They worked him from start to finish, finally to the point where he got to a couple days before free agency and said, I didn't think I was ever leaving, but there's no way I'm signing. And guess what? They buckled on everything in the end. They would have given him everything that he wanted. And I just think this hardball negotiation, and guess what? To be totally fair, if Mikko Rantanen and some of the emotion that he displayed in his interviews after the trade, particularly one to a Finnish reporter, then his camp wears some of this as well, the hard end of this negotiation, because there's probably a way that you could have worked all this out and made it so that everyone was a little bit uncomfortable, because I think that's like the mark of a good deal. But man, I get the idea of getting something for him. I would have never let him go.
So as poet laureate Jules from Pulp Fiction once said, allow me to retort. So it's interesting that you use the Blues with Pietrangelo, because we look at the economics of it all. Well, it's the same team. And again, not saying this is like for like, but understanding financial freedom and the flexibility of it. That's the same team that was able to use offer sheets this summer. And look how that has turned out for them, getting when Philip Broberg's been healthy and the year Dylan Holloway's having. So yes, there is something to be said for being financially flexible. The hardest part with trading anyone like Mikko Rantanen was this. What were you going to be getting that was of equal or greater value? And the reality is there was not going to be a deal that existed where such thing would exist. What, him for Nikita Kucherov? And even then, there would be people who would say, like, is that really a fair deal? Because Nikita Kucherov is an MVP. So again, there's never going to be anything that was going to be truly like for like. But to that point, and if you're the Avalanche, perhaps this is the logic behind it. You think about where you've been since you've won the Cup. There's been an over-reliance on your superstars of Nathan McKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, and Cale Makar. And from it, you have to start asking some really difficult questions in terms of how do you make this team stronger throughout the lineup? And if that means you move on from a player, which, yes, to your point, you're asking for him to take an extra salary that's more than $5 billion in the grand scheme of things. But the thing with the Avalanche and other teams in the league who look at money a particular way is, What is the best usage of that money? Is it on one player who, yes, he does a lot for you offensively, or do you take that money and spread it out in different ways to where you strengthen that lineup? Like, yes, you're going to have a 6'4" hole that can not only create for himself, he can create for others. He was able to work in cohesion with Makar and McKinnon, but he was able to work independently away from Makar and McKinnon and be one of the most dangerous players in the league. There's no questioning that. But when you look
what would
at
you
what
do?
is,
Like, where do you come out on that?
Sure.
Are you more I'm gonna this is just speaking agnostically, like not with the names on the back, but are you more of I'd rather pay the player or I'd rather get the depth?
I'd rather win. And I feel like if you're a general manager, you're going to do whatever the hell you can to try to win. And if you're the Colorado Avalanche, you think it's about trying to use that money in a way to where it's not going to one guy, it's going to multiple, with the idea that the two guys that you've got to pay, one you are paying, one you know you're going to pay down the road, are going to be what they are. So that's where there's a gamble. I mean, I take it you're on the side of you pay the player, you figure out everything else as it comes along.
Yeah, because the cap space is constantly increasing. That's been the one outlier of the last 5 years with COVID and everything else, is the cap space wasn't increasing. So I think a lot of teams that got themselves into trouble with having, like, let's rewind back to 2019. So the Leafs signed all these guys, Marner, Matthews, Tavares, then they eventually pay Nylander. All those things happen, and then the pandemic hits. Had the pandemic not hit, which, I mean, I guess we could get hit by a meteor tomorrow. Like, you never know what's going to happen. But had the pandemic not hit, the Leafs would be in a pretty decent cap situation right now. They're not, because the cap space didn't go up. But I'm looking at projections and I'm going, okay, we know for sure that next season's salary cap is going to be somewhere between 95 and 97. It's at 88 right now. Right. 3 years from now, NHL GMs are operating under the belief that it's going to be 110. So if it's 110, 14 million for Mikko Rantanen doesn't scare me. I'm paying him, like, whatever it is, like, hey, look, I want to maybe squeeze you down to 13 or 12.75, or I'll give you $1 over what Nathan McKinnon makes, whatever it might be, to make you feel like we're showing you the value. But I'm just like, I think you can find the other guys to fit around your lineup and do them in interesting, like, when you have top end pieces like that, you get, this is a terrible example, but you get someone that's on the open market to take less. Like Jeff Skinner, he could have gotten 5 or 6 million on the open market, but he took less to go to Edmonton because he could play with Connor McDavid.
Or like Matt Duchene, what we've seen the last few years, especially this season.
But those guys you can find somewhere and say, hey, come do it in Colorado with these 3 guys that are the 3 spokes of the wheel. You don't have that anymore. You don't have a pillar. And I think the other part of this from the Colorado perspective is, I think they bought really high on Martin Necas. Like, this is the highest that Martin Necas' value is ever going to be, I think, because he's just having this season that not many people saw coming. But the other part of it is Martin Necas has really been quiet the last 6 weeks after a crazy start to the year. So it's a lot of things at once. It's, no, you're not getting the equal value of Rantanen. You didn't get a first round pick. You didn't get one of Carolina's top prospects. And it seems like you bought high on Necas. That I add all those things up and I'm like, if they were trading today, Mikko Rantanen, did they get the very best possible return that they could for him?
Of course, the hard part in answering that is we won't know unless they win the cup. Then if they do, it's like, well, maybe they knew what they were doing. But this is what also makes a deal like this complicated. So there's all the different things you mentioned. With Necas, there's 2 things if you're banking on if you're the Colorado Avalanche. The first is when players come there, their numbers increase exponentially. We saw it with Nazem Kadri, Devon Toews goes there, Andrei Burakovsky. The list sort of goes on and on. Jonathan Drouin being another example as well. And before, let's say, the start of this season, before he got injured, you think about the year Ross Colton was having before the injury. Again, you put in players in that system, whether it takes them immediately or a year, the majority of them find ways. But then this is another theme that's sort of gone on with the Avalanche, not just this season, but really in the time that Chris MacFarland's been the general manager. there has been a lot of course correcting, and it has come to play this season. So they used the summer to sign Casey Middlestat after trading him because they felt they finally had their second line center. There have been times this season Casey Middlestat has been on the fourth line, and for what you're paying him and the expectations, that's just not what you would expect. And in some ways, not that, again, this is comparable, but in some ways, when you think about a second line center or someone that you're paying or projecting to be your second line center playing fourth line minutes, it's not the exact same situation as Ryan Johansson. It just isn't. But it does reaffirm, why does the second line center position become a problem for the Colorado Avalanche? So what do you do to solve that problem? That's where you're hoping Martin Necas can fill that void. But again, as it comes back to this conversation about the Avalanche and what they try to do with course correcting, what they've done with their goaltending this year just really speaks to that. Yes, they were able to flip Alexander Georgiev and Justus Noonan to go get Mackenzie Blackwood and Scott Wedgwood. But with that, especially with Blackwood, you're having to pay a premium, and his salary, doubles from what it was in San Jose to where it is going to be in Colorado for the foreseeable future. And that, to me, just seems like it's the interesting part about the Avalanche. Well,
that's like a chunk of money that could have gone to Rantanen.
Look, you're not wrong. There's no questioning you are not wrong. But if you're them and you see it from this vantage point of a lack of depth and a lack of secondary and tertiary support is what's hurt you the last few years in the playoffs, maybe this is worth it. But you also make a valid point that if the cap is going to go up the way people think, at the end of the day, what is an extra $5 million on top of what you're already paying them?
It's easy to say from here. I get it.
Yeah, easily. Yeah. And that's just the hard part, because you look around teams in the league and you go, hey, Florida's found a way to make it work. Vegas has found a way to make it work in terms of just having guys with high salaries and still being able to bring in those players. We've seen Dallas, maybe not exactly like that. They're about to go through that this offseason. But you're seeing teams find a way to make it work. But it just seems like the difference between all those other teams and the Avs, yes, the three of them have won a cup, of course. But with Vegas, you know what they've been. You know they have depth. With Florida, Florida has depth. With Colorado, that's been the billion-dollar question, but it's an even bigger question of, was it worth sacrificing one of the best players in the game to get that depth and financial flexibility?
Well, I think the other part that we don't know yet is, what else do the Avs have in store before March 7th?
Absolutely.
That's why
that's a real possibility.
I urged everyone to not judge or grade Chris MacFarland and Joe Sakic yet, because they have 5.5 weeks left to work. So let's see what they bring in. I have zero doubt. They've been arguably the most active team in the NHL so far this season. I have zero doubt that they're making another move before then. I don't know what it is. Could it be a Brock Nelson type? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's someone else that is younger that fits it's almost like they're retooling. Like, I got a bit of vibes from Chris MacFarland's commentary this weekend, kind of like what we heard from Chris Drury and the Rangers, not so much out loud, but behind the scenes, which was, we don't have it. Like, they did win a cup, and the team that came back after that, losing Comfer and losing Kadri and losing a lot of those pieces, they had important decisions to make, and the team obviously just no cup winner is ever back complete, but they're not as deep. And then it's almost like they made the determination with their core that right now what we have isn't good enough to win a Stanley Cup. So let's redo it. Let's reimagine it. I just think when you have that player that's in his prime of his career and is going to be for the next long time in Rantanen, that's not the guy that you move out. But I don't know. I mean, teams, like, there's no one perfect way to do this.
There's not, but I mean, it goes back to what you said about A, we don't know what else they've got planned, but B, it is what has happened in the playoffs the last few years and sort of the challenges they faced. And the number one thing they kept running into is they kept playing teams with depth. So you go back to that first round exit against the Kraken, which that almost feels like a long time ago, but the thing the Kraken were able to do better than the Avalanche was rely on its overall cast of characters. So there's that. You fast forward to the following year. Yes, they're able to get all this these contributions for people against what looked like a really deep Winnipeg Jets team with just the way that the Avs were able to score and score. But then they go against the Dallas Stars, and once again, that lack of depth continues to be an issue. And even when you look at how they performed this season, yes, the inconsistent goaltending was the culprit. There's no question about why that contributed to the Avs start. But even with that, there's still this idea that even though the goaltending is there, there's still an incompleteness about them. So let's look around the rest of the West real quick. Dallas is a team that has a lot of depth. Yes, they're trying to get more, but the Stars have a lot of it. The Winnipeg Jets seem like they're not running out of it anytime soon, especially with their forwards and how they score goals and the contributions they get there. As of last week, the Kings believe had more players with 10 points, 20 points in their lineup than I believe any other team in the West, or if not any other team, every other team in the West, it's up there. Vegas is in the same conversation. Yes, Edmonton is taking some time, but we saw what Edmonton did last season, where for all the conversations about McDavid and Draisaitl in the postseason, you saw the value of having depth, especially with that penalty kill. That is how you win in this league. And when you're the Avalanche and you do not have that, and to be a franchise that every offseason comes in with this expectation of, we think this is a year where you can win the cup, but yet you're looking at them now going, they're a wild card team. Maybe they're a team that possibly gets one of the 3 central spots, but for now they're a wild card team. And not only that, but when you look at how teams like Minnesota are doing it, which, quick side note, when that buyout goes down, the Minnesota Wild are going to be dangerous with the way they draft. Like, you're giving Bill Guerin, a man who's not had a lot of money with the way that they draft and develop with Judd Brackett. Like, thoughts and prayers. But to go back to the Avs,
I just think the balance of power has changed in the West. Like, I don't look at the Avs the same as I did now. And maybe in the long run, that thought process will change. But I had been saying, hey, man, all season long, watch out for the Avs. Look how good those 3 players are playing. Those 3 players carried that team. Maybe it's possible that McKinnon is just that good and Makar is just that good that they won't have the same drop-off. I just think we're vastly, if that's the calculation or play that the Avs have made, I think they're vastly underappreciating Mikko Rantanen.
Perhaps, but again, of course, it's that question of, but if they win it all, then maybe they knew what they were doing, but that's always going to be the most difficult part is whatever Colorado doesn't do, that Carolina does do, that's how this trade is always going to be looked at, especially if Carolina can re-sign Mikko Rantanen and they're able to win with him, whether it is this year or if they re-sign him at some point within that deal. But again, that's the hard part is it's all about what philosophy and what approach you think was the right one. And if you're the Avs, you're putting a lot on Makar, a lot on McKinnon, but more importantly, you're putting a lot on the supporting cast. And to your point about the balance of power in the West, it seems like right now no one knows who has the balance of power in the West other than it is 5 teams or 6 teams. And whoever's coming in the wild card, that's a challenge. That's how competitive the West has been the last few seasons.
Well, I think what we did see, though, over the weekend is a clear change in the balance of power in the East. I view Carolina as the instant Stanley Cup favorite. And maybe that's some recency bias on a lot of what I was just saying about Mikko Rantanen and how I feel about him. But more so, I'm looking at this team that they went out and accomplished the one thing that they had been missing for so long, which is a game breaker and a game changer. They've got the guy now. And I think he's perfectly capable of standing on his own 2 feet away from McKinnon and Makar to help drive play and be the guy that shoulders it all. He's got a fellow Finn in Sebastian Aho that I think will go a long way in helping get him comfortable and settled. I think they'll work and play well off of each other. And I think this Eastern Conference is not very good. Just facts. The Florida Panthers, two-time Stanley Cup finalists in a row, I don't think they're as good this year. They don't scare me. I don't think Boston, Tampa, go through the rest of, it's not the Rangers. The Devils haven't played well the last 6 weeks. the door was wide open for someone to burst through. And I think Carolina went a long way this weekend in terms of making that statement that they could be that team. Do you agree or disagree?
Somewhere in the middle, because it's hard to discount the other teams in the East because A, there's so much time left before the deadline, and B, like, while yes, we might look at Florida now, we know that we judge Florida once April hits. So just that's the only caveat to keep in that. But
yeah, I just don't think their defense is as good as it was.
Perhaps, but again, it's just we don't know what's going to happen between now and the deadline. But point being with Carolina is absolutely, I don't know how they couldn't be considered a favorite in the East. Never mind the East to literally win the whole thing, because it goes back to what you just said. The way they're built, the way they've been able to use the draft, the way they've been able to develop from within, they've become that team that's done a strong job being able to sort of fill their own needs. But it felt like the one need they couldn't fill was, like you said, that one player who can change everything, that superstar. They've developed stars, but in terms of like that superstar, that's always sort of been the hard thing. Whereas if now they have that, not only do they have that, but they have that in someone who can affect play in all sorts of different ways. It readjusts the line combinations. It gives you a different dimension of what you're doing. You think it can possibly jumpstart a power play, but more importantly, he's that person that you brought in who has gone to where you're trying to get to as a franchise. Like Mikko Rantanen knows what it's like to win a cup. He knows what it's like to play in difficult playoff games. And not that the Hurricanes haven't had that experience, because we've seen the last few seasons, they've had some really difficult exits. But you've brought in someone who can be that voice in the lineup that says, this is how we can approach this situation. This is how we can handle this situation. But also, more importantly, you have someone who can not only take on that responsibility of being an extra voice, an extra leader in the room, but if he is not scoring, he is setting someone up to score. Mm-hmm. Or even if he doesn't have the puck, what he's doing away from the puck is going to create enough attention that it is going to free up other people. Because when we look at when McKinnon, Rantanen, and Landeskog were at their peak when they were all playing together, and the late Peter McNabb, God rest his soul, made this point. He would say, when you look at those three, it's all about the movement and the way they create space. And really, it's not even about who has the puck with those three. It's about who doesn't have the puck. And the way they're able to move around and cycle and get in position, he's like, that is what made that trio so dangerous when they were cohesive. And yes, we've not seen that trio, of course, but when you look at the elements of what made them successful, that's a good chunk of Mikko Rantanen's game right there.
Well, the big question then is, can the Canes get Rantanen re-signed? And I think the big difference that not everyone has computed here is when you look back at last year's Canes team, when they got Jake Gensel, think about all the guys that they had to take care of.
Yeah.
They let Shea walk and Pesci walk and Stefan Nason walk and Teuvo Teravainen. Like, had they been in that spot and tried to re-sign Gensel at the same time, they would have been $20 million over the cap. Now they can re-sign everyone and Mikko Rantanen and be like, I'm just saying, like, I'm penciling in the Leon Draisaitl deal at $14 million and be $6 million under the cap. So they've got the wherewithal. And what amazes me about this deal from Carolina's perspective is that they still didn't give up a first-round pick. Like, they've got the two best players that have moved at the deadline. Like, I'm sorry, even if there is no better player that's getting traded between now and then than Mikko Rantanen. I'm sorry. That's not happening before March 7th. So if that's fact, they've gotten the two best players that have been traded over the last two deadlines and didn't give up a first-round pick and didn't give up any of their top 5 prospects. That's bananas.
I mean, the reason I'm laughing is, like, you're absolutely right, but that's what makes them so damn dangerous as an organization. Is it's not even that they have the money to spend; they know how to spend the money, but they weren't in a position to where they had to give up something for the future. And it's almost like this deal is too perfect, if too perfect makes sense, or is even a thing for a team like them, because, look, asset management has always been the core tenet of how the Carolina Hurricanes operate, whether that's Don Waddell, now Eric Tulsky, it doesn't matter. It's always been about how do you manage assets in a way that allows you not only be successful right now, but years down the line. And to your point, yeah, Carolina has an exodus last season. And it's questions of, well, yes, well, they still have a lot left. How will they look? Still look really good. Now you go out and add a top 10 player in this league, a top 3 winger, top 5 winger, however you want to break them down. All of a sudden, yeah, you look a lot more dangerous, but you're able to keep an eye on the future. And let's say you're able to re-sign Rantanen as well. Now all of a sudden you're looking at other players that you're trying to bring up from a farm system, an extremely successful farm system. And that's going to have so much cost certainty. You're going to be able to really find ways to not only manage the cap, but who's to say what else that you're able to do. And that's what, if you're in the NHL right now as an executive, you're looking at what teams like Carolina are doing, what Dallas is doing, what Minnesota can do once the combined buyouts go down. And like, that's the formula to win. Yes, we've seen Tampa and Colorado do it, and Vegas has done it in its own way. Because again, the farm system, when they were winning, just hadn't really been what it is compared to other teams that have had decades. But that's sort of that perfect tenor you want to hit. It's how do you find those players in your system that have been able to win over the last several years? Who are those guys you look at now saying, we think they can carry it going forward? But how do you find yourself to be in a position where you can get the money to go and take a big swing? And it took about as big of a swing as you can get. So I guess here's the question for you. If you had to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not happening, 10 being, yeah, it's going to happen, where would you rate their odds and chances of being able to get a deal done for Rantanen and him staying longer than just this season?
A 9. I think they go into this eyes wide open. Like, they know, I think, what it's going to cost. And it might be that Draisaitl deal. I think they got a good feel of, because they know Aho so well and he's friends with Rantanen, like, would the Canes, like, let's say it's the summertime and he played out his deal in Colorado and he's a free agent on the market, would the Canes have been on a short list of teams that he would have been interested in? I think the answer to that is yes. I think what they need to do is get out of their own way, because they waited way too long on Gensel. I think in the end, in the last day or two before free agency, they finally gave Gensel what he would have gotten in Tampa. And they just thought that they had more time on the clock. They didn't. Gensel was north of a point per game player for them. He was kind of a perfect
He was
fit.
fantastic.
Yeah. So what were you doing in April and May last year when you should have been talking extension with him? This time around, I think they're going to give Rantanen some, just a minute to get his feet wet, understand his surroundings and the market and all those things. But I think they got to get on this in relatively short order, because I think the other part of this deal is that I know I just mentioned that the East is wide open. I think Tom Dundon is crazy enough that as this deal was getting put together, he was sitting there saying, well, we got 5 weeks to sign him. And if not, we'll just send him somewhere else. Maybe we could get
You really think
back.
so?
Yeah, maybe we could get more back for Mikko Rantanen than we gave up. I think that's, given the package that was paid, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility.
It's interesting from an asset management standpoint of, like, you essentially rented a guy for 5 weeks just to get more out of him. But then it's like, well, but as we've talked about, you're not going to ever get anything of really true equal value. So what could you get if you're the Hurricanes, if you were in that hypothetical? But look, to that point of being able to re-sign him quickly, there is no question about it, because make no mistake, if you were not willing to pay that kind of money, someone else will. There are plenty of teams that will find the space to sign a guy like Mikko Rantanen. But to that point about Carolina and being quick, yes, you're right. It seems like the ghost and the scars of what they learned and what they went through with the Jake Gensel situation, clearly that you would think that's played a role in sort of how you approach things now. But it's not only about like getting him signed and saying, hey, we can win with you right now, but we can not only win with you in the future, but also like you're it. Because that's always sort of been the interesting thing about the way the Avalanche were set up, is it's not enough to have one superstar. You have 3 superstars. And it's just like, for as talented as Mikko Rantanen was, even before Makar popped off, McKinnon turned into a Hart Trophy winner and a perennial favorite. It was one of those things where you could sort of see the vision, but in some ways, not afterthought, because it's definitely not afterthought, but Mikko Rantanen was not the first name people mentioned.
He was always the third guy. Always.
Or second. Because when there is that point where, let's say, it's him, Landeskog, and McKinnon, like, yes, Gabriel Landeskog before the injury was about as consistent of a player as it gets. But the way Mikko Rantanen was getting into that 40-goal, 50-goal conversation, consecutive seasons of more than 50 assists, and was making all-star games. I remember having this conversation with an executive a couple years ago where they were saying, hey, we asked a question in our office today. Who would you rather have between Draisaitl and Rantanen? And they were like, he was like, I know that might sound like a bizarre question, but let's just say that it was a conversation. So that's the kind of respect Mikko Rantanen has around the league. But now he's going to a place where when you start talking about why the Carolina Hurricanes are going to win, he is going to be the first name. And there is something to be said for a player going into a situation where there is not only more responsibility on your shoulders, but he's the franchise player. Like, Colorado had 3 of them. Now they're down to 2. Carolina has franchise players, but that dude's a franchise player. And to have that and to know that he is that, and to know that they can win and still win, and the way they manage money, if you're Garrett Tolsky and the Canes, you're creating a vision and saying, this is our vision board. We see you as the centerpiece of that. Come here, come get paid, speak Finnish. Homeboy, we've got a Bojangles right down the road that you'll like. Come check out some NC State football games. You want to make it seem like you do not want to go anywhere else. And that Raleigh is the perfect place for you to be forever, forever, ever, forever, ever.
Yeah, I can see it. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. We'll get to the Chicago Blackhawks part in Taylor Hall. We didn't even talk about that yet in 1 second, but let's bring in Tyler Yaremchuk for some fill in the blank.
Forever, ever? That's a great line, Ryan. Fill in the blank at Bet365. Download the app today. Use the promo code NATION. I think you guys kind of tied in perfectly to the first fill in the blank I had for you, and it's this. If it's not Carolina, the best spot you see for Mikko Rantanen this summer is blank. Frank?
I mean, the truth is everywhere, anywhere. Like, where does Mikko Rantanen not work? If not Carolina, then the New York Rangers. Because if I'm them, I'm going, look, Panarin, I love you, but you need a new deal, and we'll have you guys together for 1 year, but Rantanen's going to be the guy after that. And, you know, Panarin's getting older. There's a real question about whether or not he's the guy that delivers in the playoffs. Can he be that guy? I would say the Rangers.
Fair. Ryan?
If you're looking at teams that are trying to win right now, I would say, if not the Rangers, the Minnesota Wild, because again, like, that would be some real, like, smart work by Bill Guerin, but it would be some nasty work at the same time. But if you're looking at a project, Chicago's interesting. And if you're looking at, hey, if he was really willing to be patient, him as a San Jose Shark would be fascinating when you think about what they're trying to do. But for a guy like that who looks like he's trying to win now, you would think it would be one of those teams like a Carolina, New York, or Minnesota. It'd be interesting seeing a former Av going to the Wild, but you would think a team in that sort of echelon.
Yeah. Next one I got for you, Frank, you kind of said, like, this is going to be the best player traded ahead of the deadline. But there is another high-end pending UFA out there, and it's Mitch Marner. Listen, I know the answer is going to be low, but I want the answer anyways. There is a blank % chance that Mitch Marner gets traded from the Toronto Maple Leafs before the deadline, Ryan?
Less than 10% maybe, because again, it's what are you going to go get for Mitch Marner that's of equal or greater value? And also, here's the thing about the Leafs. Once again, they're in a January where they look good. They look really good. They're scoring. They're playing defense. They're getting contributions from everywhere. This is one of the stronger teams they've had in terms of when they've had that core together to try to go win. And so, again, it's one of those, unless you get something so hella outrageous that like there's a Nikita Kucherov deal to be made. And again, sorry to keep bringing up Kucherov, but there's a reason. Unless you get something like that, if you're the Leafs, you try to add rather than subtract someone like Marner with the idea that you think maybe this is the year you win the East. What about you, Frank?
I'm going to say, I think your answer is correct. So but I want to be different. So I'm going to say 20%.
Okay.
And I think about it from this perspective. The Colorado Avalanche won a cup with this guy. And they said, yeah, but we can't not get anything for him. The Leafs have nothing to show for anything. They have not made it past the second round. How do you twist yourself into a pretzel and say, yeah, but we got to keep him and play out the string? I just think this team that's had all this success has drawn a hard line. If you're the Leafs, then you have to. Doesn't this now set the table? You've got a somewhat close, Marner is on the next level down in my eyes in terms of echelon of player in the NHL. Doesn't this now set the marketplace for what a potential return could look like for you to get? The complicating factor here is that Marner holds all the cards with the full no trade, no move, that Rantanen didn't need any approval and didn't get any. He found out in Boston when he was out to dinner on Friday night. He had no idea this was coming. So that's the key separator. But if I'm the Leafs, I'm going, oh my God, this team that's had way more success than us, they're ripping the Band-Aid off here. What we can't sit back here and oh my God, we're scared. What happens if we trade Mitch Marner? What are we going to do? I think they have to give it more consideration now because the Avs have now done it. They've done the hard part.
Yeah, again, a month ago, it sounded crazy, at least to me, to be like, oh, the Avs will trade Mikko Rantanen. I mean, up until I read your tweet, Frank, we were actually live taping a podcast out in Jasper. And like, you can see me on the video, like my jaw hits the floor. I'm like, holy shit, Frank just tweeted what had to do the double. Is that actually Frank? It is actually Frank. So yeah, like the Marner question seems maybe out there a little bit, but nothing should seem out there after what we saw on Friday night.
Let me add one thing. And look, I believe that the Carolina Hurricanes at least inquired about Mitch Marner as they were going through this process with Mikko Rantanen. I don't know how far they got. I don't know if it's a possibility that maybe they were not on a team that Mitch Marner would go. I have no idea. But I would be very surprised if in doing their homework that Carolina, look, they were in on Pettersson, Miller, Rantanen. I'd be very surprised if they did not at least inquire, or even more strongly than that, with the Toronto Maple Leafs about Mitch Marner.
Interesting. All right, let's go away from the trade for a second here. Another piece of news that came down over the weekend is that Alex Pietrangelo is going to step aside from the Four Nations Faceoff, so Canada needs a replacement. It was also interesting that the night after this announcement comes, he plays 24 minutes for the Vegas Golden Knights. But the player who should replace Pietrangelo on the Golden Knights blue, or on the Team Canada blue line, is blank, Frank.
I know everyone's going to say Drew Doughty because, take a right shot guy and plug him in. I think that's a tough ask. Drew Doughty hasn't played this season. He's still a handful of games away from returning, and it has been at the top of his list. Like when I've been reporting on Drew Doughty all season long, he was so fired up in training camp because he wanted to prove to Team Canada that he could make it for this Four Nations face-off, and he's been highly motivated to get back just in case there was an injury exactly like this one. I just think that's a lot to ask of any player, though. And I know how good he is, but man, to not play all season and then get thrown in the deep end of the pool in Montreal against Team USA in best on best play, that's a lot. But I'd probably look elsewhere. I'd look at Josh Morrissey or someone else.
Ryan?
Morrissey or someone else, I can never be sure, would make a ton of sense, but I will go with Drew Doughty for kind of the opposite reason, because what has been the narrative the last 5 years about Drew Doughty? Oh, like in this era of puck moving defensemen, it's like, what about Drew Doughty? Well, Drew Doughty's actually having some of the best seasons of his career, not only just with production, but everything that he does. Because when he got injured, one of the biggest questions the Kings had to face is how do you fill all the absences that this man is created? Because it's the top pairing role. It's the 5-on-5 minutes. It's quarterbacking the power play. It's the minutes he eats on the penalty kill. He does everything. And so that's why if you're Hockey Canada and you're looking at trying to figure out who your replacement is going to be, that might be a lot to ask of him, but he's been asked of a lot the last few years. And the answer has been, he's been among the more consistent defensemen in this league who can be trusted in several situations. So for that reason, let's go with Drew Doughty.
Yeah, I don't hate the Doughty pick. And another thing, like we talked about this with the third goalie debate with Team Canada. It's like, why wouldn't you take Marc-Andre Fleury? It's a short tournament. Have him a good guy in the room. Like if you're bringing Drew Doughty and you're kind of like, he's our 6, maybe he's our 7, maybe you just kind of want to have him around as well. There you go, boys. That is a wrap on this week's edition of Fill in the Blank, brought to you by Bet365.
And one thing to note, I did check in with the NHL this morning. This is not the same as an All-Star weekend. Obviously, a much bigger commitment. You're talking about 10 days, 2 weeks. There will be no suspension or any discipline for Alex Pietrangelo for him making his decision to not participate in Four Nations. I know a couple people had asked that question, so I did ask, and the answer is no. Just to put a bow on the trade before we move on, we didn't mention Taylor Hall and the Chicago Blackhawks' role in this deal. They eat half of Rantanen's salary to make it happen. I think a lot of people were confused. Why doesn't Chicago get 2 assets here? One for Taylor Hall and another one to take on half of Rantanen's deal. I can answer that part of it. I think they had a pretty good sense of what the market was going to be like for Hall, and it was trending toward a 3rd-round pick, which from a contending team is a late 3rd-round pick. So they decided to get their own back, which is kind of the best 3rd-round pick available, more or less like a late 2nd. And then what if Taylor Hall had lingered? I think this is the part that no one really thinks about or talks about, because everyone thinks when you're trading a player, you're like best case scenario. But what about worst case scenario? Hall had been further down the Hawks lineup of late. He played 4th line minutes recently. What happens if you hold out with Taylor Hall and you get a 4th-round pick? And then you need someone to take on some of his salary, so you get a 4th and a 6th. You're retaining half. You're using your last slot there. I don't know. It just... People were saying, why didn't Chicago get more? And I understand the question, but what happens if later they kept him and Chicago got less? Carolina was willing to take on the whole deal. I think people forget that part of the equation.
That's fair that Carolina is able to take on the whole deal. They're able to get a pick that hypothetically can look at as a late 2nd rounder. But yes, it's that question, and several people had it of, but why couldn't you get more, especially when you look at them in separate situations? Because let's take the Rantanen salary out of the equation for a second. There's just the value that you want to get for Taylor Hall. But then when you think about what it takes to retain someone's salary, and this is where it gets interesting, cumbersome, whatever word you want to use, teams like the Blackhawks that are in a rebuild, it's all about having as much draft capital as humanly possible. And it seems like that's really been the big question is you couldn't get additional draft capital for eating up 50% of a salary. Especially a salary as large as that, you're talking north of $4 million. Because let's say even if they had traded Hall and had to eat salary there, he's a $6 million contract, so that's 3. It's still less than Rantanen. And it seems like that's where the confusion sort of comes from. Now, yeah, of course, the Blackhawks, they have draft capital. You look at how they're positioned over the next 3 draft cycles. They've got multiple picks in multiple rounds. I believe they have 2 first-round picks in this year's draft. I want to say, 2 in the first round this year and either 2 in the 2nd round or 3rd round this year. Either way, They've got multiple picks throughout the first 3 rounds. So they're in a situation where they look like they can add to what they still feel is a promising future there. But not being in a position to maybe add more, that's where it sort of gets kind of, again, interesting in terms of, okay, why couldn't there be more of it? To your point, who knows what the market could have been on Taylor Hall, but if you're the Blackhawks, this is what makes the need to hit on those other potential trades even bigger. So you think about someone like, let's say, like a Ryan Donato, for example.
Yep.
Like if
that's
you
what I was going
to
say. They can use that last retained salary transaction slot. It doesn't have to be Donato. It could be Seth Jones. It could be Connor Murphy. It could be Donato. It could be Jason Dickinson. They like, if you look in Kyle Davidson's playbook, Jake McCabe or others like Brandon Hay, like they've used that retained salary really strongly to juice their return on a bigger deal. So not using it on Hall, I think, is really powerful because now you've got options. And I do think teams have been calling about Seth Jones, and I do think there's a possibility that you could use that last slot on him. I think it's unlikely because you've really got to offer up something really good, I think, for Chicago to want to have that dead money on your books for that long. That's really a long, long time. Like they should be in a contender mode by the time that deal is up with Seth Jones. Do you really want millions of dollars sitting there on your cap that's dead space? Look at what we just talked about with the Wild, how difficult that is. Not the same amount of money for that long, but it's not easy to manage that. So if you're going to do it, it has to be for something really good.
Well, not only that, but it kind of likens it a little bit to what the Sharks situation was with how do you move on from Brent Burns and how do you move on from Erik Karlsson and all the money that's tied up there. Whereas if like, yes, now they're still in a rebuild, but you think about what those buyouts are, especially Karlsson, and it seems like that's less of a pain point as time goes along. Yeah, it helps that you've got young players on the cheap and you've been able to bring in veterans that if you want to move on from them at the deadline or in the near future, for draft capital, you could. But yeah, if you're the Blackhawks, like you would have to get something so substantial that it would absolutely have to be worth it for you to pay that kind of premium.
Yeah. Let's wrap up the show with the Vancouver Canucks, because I think maybe the biggest loser in all of this over the last, 48 to 72 hours is Vancouver, because I think Carolina had presented a real significant escape path. Whether it was JT Miller or Elias Pettersson, Carolina was interested in taking on one of those players. I think we're juggling a whole bunch of different things at once. Do we go after Rantanen? Or we solidify that? Do we, key in on Pettersson? Miller, I think, was a little bit further down the board as a check down option and obviously would have cost even less. I think in the end, Carolina makes the correct call and grabs the best player of the bunch. However, that leaves Vancouver right back to where they were, which is, oh my God, what are we doing and how do we fix this? And I don't know now who else enters the fray. There was some reporting over the weekend about Buffalo. I wonder if there's other teams now that are sitting out here going, well, we don't need to pay that much for players that have that much term and dollars like Miller at that age. What if we could get in it and get involved and buy low on Miller now? I think that's got to be a consideration for some other teams in the East.
It absolutely has to be. But if you're the Vancouver Canucks, you're now having to play this game of patience. And it's like you're fighting a war on multiple fronts, or hypothetical proverbial war on multiple fronts. Let's see, you're going through challenges on multiple fronts, because it's who are you going to move if you move any of them? How do you still feel about this dynamic being in place at a time in which consistency has been a challenge? But also, whatever move you make, do you think this is going to be the sort of move that A, helps you get back to the playoffs for a consecutive season, B, helps you remain a perennial playoff team, and C, do you think you're going to be able to get the value you can if you move on from either one of them? And that's where it's like, yeah, if you're the Canucks, you look at what goes on with Carolina and you're wondering, okay, will something like this be presented again? Like, will there be a team out there that says, here is what we are willing to part with, and it's a deal that you feel can not only help you now, but in the future? And so, like, if you're the Canucks, and you just talked about it with the Avs a little bit ago, sure, you want to try to be able to get something beyond just a player who can play now, maybe someone for the future, especially for one of those two players. But in terms of what a deal could look like, who it could look like, who all would be involved, it seems like those are the big questions to answer, because right now it is a mystery in terms of what the Canucks are going to do as we head to the deadline, assuming there's even anything that can be done. Because like that, again, that's the hard part about where they're at with trying to move on from anyone is all the situations you mentioned earlier in the East. Like, everybody's got to be able to be smart about how they manage money, so on and so forth. But like, is there a situation where you see a team in the East saying, we think this could happen? Or do you think those guys just end up staying in Vancouver?
No, I think they have to do something. I think this has reached the point of no return. And I think it's just on a sliding scale of, hey, Pettersson's just more valuable than Miller. I think they're open to moving either one, but they have to do something. I don't think they can continue on like they have. And, best case scenario, I think, for them would have been to just, speaking of hard lines in the sand, they should have went to that team in early December and said, guys, we're not trading anyone here. I know it's ugly, but you got to figure it out amongst yourselves. And instead, it was like the other direction. It was one log continually placed on the fire to make this thing an absolute inferno. And I think there were a bunch of missteps by a bunch of different people that have put this team in a spot where I think they're in real danger of not making the playoffs. And look, to be this Canucks team after what they had last year and totally different roster, but to miss out on the playoffs to a team like, I don't know, just for hypothetical, the Flames were just happy to be here. The Canucks entered the season with Stanley Cup aspirations, and to have that all play out the way that it has, I don't think you can calculate or characterize it as anything other than a big misfire this year. So I think Vancouver can't sit back and be idle.
Well, to that point, and we're getting a little off topic, but it felt like that was always the big question with the Canucks going into this season, wasn't it? Was, do they have enough to show that last season wasn't a one-off? And that's sort of been the hard thing about the Vancouver Canucks really over the last decade is you see the talent that's there. You see the ability that's there. And you think, why can't this team do more? Like why can't they do more? But as you look around the rest of the West and you see other teams that figure out how to consistently be a playoff team and the Canucks haven't, it just makes you ask, okay, well, what's it going to take? And maybe a trade like this, whichever one it is, maybe that's the thing that does it. Like, who knows? But either way, the Canucks have got to find answers, because for all the talent that they've had come through, whether they're still there or whether they're not there, it kind of raises questions of like, why can't they win? They need scoring help. Look at the forwards they've drafted. Oh, they need defensive. They drafted the reigning Norris Trophy winner who looks like he's going to win at least one more. They need a goalie. Look, when Thatcher Demko's healthy, he's about as good as any goalie in the league. But yet it doesn't find a cohesion that you see in other places. So,
but what if you have to blow the whole thing up, though? What if Thatcher Demko can't hack it anymore with his knee? And what if JT Miller's moving on? What if Elias Pettersson can't be the guy that delivers the mail? I mean, then you're left with Quinn Hughes and what? And I think Vancouver has way more existential questions than people properly recognize.
Oh, I mean, the Canucks certainly do, but it's also, I think, an even larger question of, but how do you know if you're at that point? Because let's take Nashville. Look, 2 years ago around this time, the Predators were asking some really major questions of what does a path forward look like? They have that active deadline where they are moving on from everyone, and it looks like, if not rebuild, then at least retool. A year later, they're in the playoffs, and you can see the vision, but you can also see where, hey, they just need some more scoring help. They go out and get that scoring help. And you look at the Predators now, and it seems like you're almost back to those same existential questions of, what does your future look like? And so that's just the thing is like, A, how do you get to that point? B, do you know if you're even in that point? And C, if you feel like you are in that point, what do you think is the best path forward, knowing that literally the whole theme of this discussion has been, can you get what you think is equal value? And if you're the Canucks, how do you assess what equal value looks like? And do you think it's enough to make your future even brighter? But again, it's that larger question of, you've been in this situation before. How do you avoid it happening again?
I was muted. I had one job. Brian, crazy times, crazy weekend in the NHL. really appreciate you hopping in and
Of course.
filling in for Jason Gregor. This is a trade we're going to be talking about for a long, long time, and really glad to chop it up with you today. Appreciate you joining us on the DFO Rundown. That was episode 354, brought to you by Bet365. Open an account with Bet365 today and bet on a huge range of markets. Use promo code NATION, that's NATION, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. We'll see you on Thursday. Got another co-host filling in. We got Pete Blackburn jumping in for Jason Gregor on Thursday. So, Ryan, appreciate the change up, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Seravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.